Okay, we're going to continue this morning with more Flexbox demos. And I just want to point out a couple of references that I'm using during this. The first reference that I linked to at the end of our formal lecture, even though these are all kind of lectures, is the CSStricks.com article on a guide to Flexbox. And this is kind of, in my understanding and evolution of learning Flexbox, this is where I started, was this article. This was an article by this Chris Coyer fellow, and he's pretty active in the CSS community. He's pretty active on this website. And so this is updated frequently. You can see it was updated as recently as April of this year. And so this article is oftentimes updated with like different levels of support and browser support and recommendations. And so this is a really good article to begin learning and starting with the background and basics and terminology, and it just jumps into the properties when you kind of land on the page. Everything from, starting of displaying flex, flex, the flex direction property of row or column, etc., flex wrap, and so just all these basics that we've been covering now for a couple of days, then into justified content. And then after kind of this, another really good place to learn any of this stuff that I always recommend is Mozilla Developer Network, MDN. And I thought I would just go through some of the code examples on MDN, kind of slow because I tend to go through things fast sometimes, and just break it down, piece by piece, that will help understand Flexbox. And so if you just Google search this or look at the URL there, you can come to this article, MDN on Flexbox, and you can kind of see this is layout with CSS. That's what Flexbox is all about, and specifically it's responsive. And so when you build a layout with CSS, your page is going to respond at different width of different devices. And so that's the benefit of using Flexbox, is you get a responsive layout, whereas historically we would lay things out with floats and maybe in the old days HTML tables. A lot of the historic ways of laying out a page and doing page layout was not reflexive, responsive, not reflexive. At any rate, and then that's kind of what it gets into here. Flexbox is a one-dimensional layout method for arranging items in rows and columns. Items flex, which mean expand to fill additional space, or shrink to fit smaller spaces. So browser window gets bigger, things can expand. Browser window gets smaller, things can shrink. This article explains the fundamentals. So I just wanted to, again, just go through this, take the time, and go through Flexbox so that we get these basics down. Why Flexbox? Again, for a long time, the only reliable cross-browser compatible tools for creating CSS layouts were things like floats and positioning. These work, but in some ways they're also limiting and frustrating. So I've taught this class for a long time. I've taught positioning with floats, and absolute positioning and relative positioning and these different kind of tools that are built into CSS. But as they say, they kind of come with problems. They break down those problems. The following simple layout designs are either difficult or impossible to achieve with such tools in any kind of convenient way, flexible way. And so these are the problems with the traditional old school way. Simply getting something vertically centered inside of its parent. Now with Flexbox, as you have been doing this for a day now, you might have realized how easy it is to get something center. Flexbox solves this problem very easily. Other problems: making all the children of a container take up the equal amount of width or height, regardless of how much width or height is available. And so you kind of see this with Flexbox that by default things kind of stretch for the height. And so the align items default value is to stretch. And then getting things to take up the same amount of width is also pretty easy. So getting things to take up the same amount of width and height is pretty easy in Flexbox. Making all the columns in a multiple column layout adopt to the same height, even if they contain a different amount of content. Kind of the same deal. Similar to that second bullet, is that you want them to take up the same amount of height. So these are the old school ways, these are the problems, and they give us a little bit of HTML to kind of demo some code. So let's just take this little mock-up HTML here and throw it into our, and we haven't written any Flexbox yet, right? All we have is some embedded CSS, no Flexbox CSS. If we break down this HTML, there's our body tag. We've got a header and a section. Inside of the section, we've got 1, 2, 3 articles. Each article has an H2 and a paragraph. The thing about this is that each paragraph has, these two paragraphs have the same amount of content. This third paragraph has more content. So you could see kind of the default behavior. So the header is going 100% width. So the header, all they do is set a height for the header and a background color for the header. Each section has an article in it. These articles have some margin on them, right? So this is what the margin of 10 pixels on every side, and that's in their CSS. And they also have a little bit of padding on them, right? So each article has margin and padding configured, 10 pixels and 10 pixels, and a background color. And then if I go into the H2, there's really nothing fancy for the H2. It's no custom CSS for the H2, no custom CSS for the paragraph. And this is the starter code for them. And they explain that starter code is basically a header and then a section and some articles. So the first thing we have to do is decide, okay, what is going to be our Flexbox? What parent is going to be a Flexbox? And looking at this markup, it's pretty obvious to me. The section tag is the obvious choice because there are 3 children, 1, 2, 3. Those articles will become the flex items. So the section will become the Flexbox. The articles will become the flex items. They will be in a row by default because that's how Flexbox works. So if you target section and tell it to display flex, let's go ahead and do that. So section, display flex, and open the website back up because I shouldn't have closed it. There is the response. The response is, because each child was a block level element, which used to go 100% width, right? Each article was 100% width before. Now they're even thirds. And so problem solves. Remember, that was kind of a challenge using other things to get everything to take up equal widths. And equal heights. Even though they have different amount of content, they all have equal height. And so, you know, the default behavior there is pretty nice, is what it boils down to. And it pretty quickly solves some of the problems that that exist with laying things out with floats and the position property. So the single declaration gives us everything that we need. We have multiple column layout with equal size columns, and these columns are all the same height. This is because the default values given to flex items are set up to solve common problems such as this. To be clear, and I hate reading to you, but I think it's worth going through kind of slowly, so I am going to read this. To be clear, let's reiterate what is happening here. The element we're giving a display value of flex is acting like a block level element in terms of how it interacts with the rest of the page. So that is the section tag, right? So the section is still displaying block as far as how it's interacting with the rest of the page, but the children inside are your flex items. In the next section, we'll explain in more detail what this means. Note also that you can use a display of inline flex. So this is something we haven't seen a lot of. If you wish to lay out an element's children as flex items, but you want it to behave like an inline element. So that's a little bit different. Right now, the section is a block level element, but if you wanted that section tag to be an inline element, you could say display inline flex, and that just changes the parent, in this case the section tag, from a block to an inline level element. If that scenario were to come up, you have that display inline flex. Okay. They get into the main axis and the cross axis. Again, there's a main start and a main end. There's a cross start and a cross end. These terms, we've covered them before. But as you start moving things around in the Flexbox, you have to understand, you know, where does the main axis start? Where does the main axis end? Where does the cross axis start? Where does the cross axis end? And then again, changing the orientation of the Flexbox, which is like one of the first things that they talk about here is flex direction. Changing it from row to column, you know, changes the main axis to be vertical and the cross axis to be horizontal. So changing the flex direction changes the main axis and the cross axis. All right, we got a flex container, which is the section tag in that example. We could then change the flex direction. I demonstrated that, and basically it's going to look a lot like it did before. And we did this yesterday in our navbar example. When we change the flex direction to be a column, we can get things going up and down. Now, one thing that I also, besides just going through this article with you guys, I'm going to do a little bit of my own just, you know, coding. And what I want to do with that is start talking about nested Flexbox containers. And so right now we've got a Flexbox, but we haven't really done much nesting, which means a Flexbox inside of a flex item. So a flex item, right, is one of these children. For example, this article. This article could also be a Flexbox. And then you would the flex items inside of article would be these two children, right? So you could have you could have nested flex boxes, Flexbox E. All right. Because of the default way that Flexbox works, it turns out that it is going to have an even width for all of the children. Well, if you have a lot of children, you might get to this issue with Flexbox where there's so many children they overflow their container. And so they give a little mock-up here, and basically this is just more articles, more articles, more articles. And so I could probably just copy these additional articles from, from here to here, and then paste them in. So if I have a whole bunch of children, and let's take a look at our page now. Now it's not actually overflowing. Let's see if there's a little bit of additional CSS that I need to write. We already have the section display flex.
Did you put the
and
flex row or flex direction row?
I don't have flex direction row, but it's kind of default flex direction row. So let's see why we're not overflowing here. I mean, I can go ahead and do that, and we're not getting that. We're not getting an overflow. And if I go back to the article, I just want to let's see if there's a width on any one of these. No articles. Go back.
Does it still have the same margin and padding?
Yeah, it has the same margin and padding that I saw. Oh, here it is. Also, add the following declaration to your article. So here's the deal. Right now, our articles are just as wide. We're letting Flexbox cram them down to be a natural size, but if we actually give each article a 200 pixel width, this should cause that overflow. So let's go back into our article, flex of 200 pixels. Now this is that shorthand for flex basis and flex grow and flex shrink. So since you just give it one value, this is just the flex basis. Maybe I just don't have enough. Hey. Article.
Is that it can't go any further because it's pretty much 100% of the browser? Because then at next point, what you probably do would be more like a flex wrap.
Yeah, what we're trying to do is a flex wrap, but yeah, right now it's just basically defaulting. But what this is saying is that we should see a scrolling effect. One issue arises when you have a fixed width or height layout is eventually your Flexbox children will overflow or their containers, breaking the layout. View it live. See, their view it live. So there you go. So I'm not really making any mistakes. Their view it live. But you can kind of see that our width is not being respected here. So let's change flex wrap to wrap, and let's change our pixels to 300, and let's do flex wrap of wrap. And now this is the behavior, right? So it's being a little bit more respectful of our width because we're telling it to wrap, and it doesn't basically have to cram them on one row. And so yeah, so when I read this article, I literally go, oh, I didn't think that was the case. And then as it turns out, maybe it just needs to be updated because even in their live example, that's not the case.
Also, is because I guess even though the screen query has been put in, is it already kind of more or less recognizing the size of your monitors or recognizing that they're two connected, so it didn't force an overflow without the flex wrap?
Yeah, I think it just boils down to without the flex wrap, it's not going to respect your flex basis here, and it's just going to cram them onto one line depending on the width of the device. So flex wrap popular for that reason, because if you say, okay, well, I want every article to be a certain width, we're going to go ahead and set the flex basis to set the width. And now you have multiple rows. And then they cover this flex flow. Historically, these shorthands were not the best for browser compatibility. And so a lot of times the recommendation from me was to not use the shorthand because they weren't compatible in all the various browsers. That was something I learned way back when reading the CSS Tricks article. They're a little bit better supported now. And so if I look at Flex Flow property here, you can see a lot of the same information. Okay, so that's flex flow, which is basically flex direction and flex wrap. So it's a shorthand for those two properties. Flex flow of row, so that's your flex direction, and wrap, which is your flex wrap. Let's see, flexible sizing of flex items. Let's learn how. Let's now return to our first example and look how we can control what proportion of space flex items take up compared to other flex items. Fire up your local copy of this one. So again, this was the 3 article without all the extra space. So let's replace that back. And all I had before was section display flex, and that should get us back to here. First, let's add the following rule to the bottom of your CSS: article flex of 1. This is a unitless proportion, meaning there's like no pixels or ems or anything like that, that dictates how much space available along the main axis each flex item will take up compared to other flex items. And so again, kind of going into the shorthand versus it's essentially, this is your shorthand. Flex is shorthand for flex grow, flex shrink, and flex basis. So since we didn't provide a unit for the flex basis, like how wide, like 100 pixels, the flex grow of 1 is what is being configured here. So we're essentially setting the flex grow of the article to be 1, and then we're saying, okay, the third article should grow twice as fast. So in this case, we're giving each article, in this case, each article, which there are 3, the same value of 1, which means they'll all take up an equal amount of space compared, it's kind of like their default is 0. Flex grow is default 0, and so you can kind of see here really no changes since they're all 1. But as we add this next rule, now add the following rule before the previous one, and so because this is actually more specific, I think you could put it after. This is a more specific selector than this. Now let's go back, and you could see that the third article basically grows twice as fast as the other two. And so again, this is the shorthand for flex basis, flex grow, and flex shrink. It's just smart enough to know that, hey, when you just put one number in there that doesn't have a unit behind it, that's the flex grow value. Now this says, okay, every article has a 200 pixel flex basis wide, and they all grow at 1. This one says that this one is also 200 pixels wide, but grows at 2. So let's see. It says, now when you refresh, you'll see that the third article takes up twice of the available width as the other two. There are now 4 portions, 1, 1, and 2. So the first one's 1, the next one's 1, the next one's 2 is 4. So it's basically 2 and 2. The first 2 items have 1 unit each, so they're like 1/4 of the available space. The third one has 2 units, so it's 2/4 of the available space, or 1/2. You can also specify, and that visually comes out to be true. You can also specify a minimum size value within the flex value. Try updating your article rules. So you can also specify a minimum size value. So at minimum, they're going to remain their flex basis, which is 200 pixels. So if I update my rules here, I'm still using this shorthand, flex grow of 1, flex grow of 2, flex basis of 200 pixels. They'll go down to, and they should stay about that 200 pixels wide. I'm kind of curious if that is 200 pixels wide. Let's take that. Let's take that off. So this third article remains 200 pixels wide. These two have a grow configured when I so all articles have a flex of 200 pixels, so the 2.
Did you override your, technically, by having article as a flex of 1 and 200 pixels? Did that kind of override your second one where you?
It did, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, this one overrides. So the third article is a more specific selector, so it's overriding this one.
Okay, I thought it was the other way around because you had that one first.
Yeah.
Plus, it kind of, when you were resizing the browser, it almost didn't seem like it because the third article has more content, so it almost doesn't seem like it grows faster than the other two.
Yeah. So this basically states each flex item will be given 200 pixels of the available space. After that, the rest of the available space will be shared according to the proportion units. So then it goes into the flex shorthand, and I discussed this several times already. The flex is a shorthand property that can specify 3 different values: the flex grow, the flex shrink, and the flex basis.
Oh, another question.
Yeah.
With regards to, say, like for those individual articles, and you want to stick a picture in that, are those flex rules still dictated by the flex rules for the section, or did you have to create new flex rules for the article itself?
So the question is, if I wanted to maybe put an image inside of this article, yeah? Is that what you were saying?
Yeah.
Yeah, it will still follow the rules of the flex file. So let's just throw an image in. And this is an image. So let's copy image address and paste. So they're all taking the same height because everything is set to stretch by default. So I don't know if I answered your question in doing that. Well, can you ask one more time?
I was just wondering if an image within the article would have its rules or behavior would be dictated by the Flex rules in the section tag of the CSS that you're doing, as opposed to, or would you have to do separate rules within that article?
Yeah, so I think you're talking about like nested Flexbox. And so if you wanted, maybe you wanted this article to be a row. So let's call that top. And then we can kind of go in here, target top, and to do display flex here. And you can kind of see now they're in a row format, albeit that's pretty ugly. We're actually getting some of that overflow going on because of all the space it's trying to take up. But yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. All right. So in the old days, I used to advise against using the shorthand because of browser compatibility. But now, according to MDN, it says we'd advise against using the longhand flex properties unless you really have to. And I think the idea is because so often you're setting all three, the flex basis, the grow, and the shrink. They lead to a lot of extra code being written, and they can be somewhat confusing. So, you know, basically minimize your code, write less code, do the same thing. I think the next thing I want to do, because I talk about horizontal and vertical alignment, I'll just do my own demo on this. And so I'll write my own. Write a main tag, and in the main tag I'll have an image, and because I still have that image kind of propped up, let's just use that image. And let's write some embedded CSS, target the main, display flex. Excuse me. The other thing about main is only going to be as tall because main's a block level element, and by default they're only as tall as the content that's in them, right? So main, if I look at this right now, that's a huge image. Let's give this a width and a height of something a little bit smaller. Okay, that's reasonable. If I inspect this and I look at main, you can see main really isn't that tall. It doesn't. It just is as tall as the content that's in it. So what I'd like to do on main is make it a little bit taller by giving it a height of 100 viewport height. So now when I inspect main, you can see that main is as tall as the browser window. And it doesn't matter if I kind of shrink this down, main is bigger. The image, though, obviously still is the same size. So I just made the container bigger. Justify content center, align item center, and this is what's needed to get something dead center. Probably the most useful thing in this whole tutorial that I've been showing you today is getting something center with those two properties, and it is responsive. So if the browser window changes as The height just changes, it's still in the center. And if I change the width, it stays in the center. Right, so super convenient, you know, getting something not only across the page, so horizontally center, you know, text align center is normally pretty good for that, but getting something vertically centered is a little bit harder traditionally. And so using Flexbox is the easiest way that I know to get a child centered in its parent. Literally a couple lines of code.
Would the position center also do that, or is that not in line with the Flex rules?
Yeah, so how would you go about, I mean, there's text align center, there's content align center, there's, and you would think that those things would work. So to your question, yes, those are not the Flex properties. Those are just CSS properties that are not considered Flexbox properties. So this is how you do it in Flexbox. And I would also say they just don't always work the way that you would expect them to. Yeah, so there's, you know, let's just say you got a paragraph. There's text align center. Align content center. Like these are two things that also kind of do that, but I've had a lot of experience where these specifically align content just didn't work the way you might think that it would. So, yep, getting something centered in a Flexbox, super easy. Okay, and then we can start getting into these one-offs where you want to put things like individual items, you want to align them differently or order them differently, you know, change the order of items. Okay, good, nested Flexbox. So I think this is going to help you with your lab because, you know, looking at this third article, I could tell that there's another Flexbox in here. So if I go to the live demo, just inspecting this, I think is going to tell a lot of the story. So keep in mind when you inspect, you can see in Chrome tools that this section is display flex. Like if you can see this little circle down here that says flex in it. So you could tell what is a flex container. That means that this section is a flex container. If I expand that, notice there's 3 articles. Take a look at this third article. This third article is also a flex container. And if I click on it, you could see I've got display flex right here in the CSS. This rule right here is display flex. Well, let's take a look at the flex flow is column. Okay, so looking at this third article, you could see that the 3 children, this div, and this div. Well, this div is also display flex. So this is the third flex parent, the third flex container, I should say. So here's the outermost flex container. This article is also a flex container, which is a column, which is why these 3 divs are being displayed vertically. But then this fellow right here has a bunch of buttons in it, which is also a flex container. Therefore, all of the children are these buttons, and these children are in a row because, again, that's the default. And this row happens to be row in wrap. Therefore, I think when you kind of shrink it down, you start seeing these buttons wrap. So this is a great example of something that will help you with your lab, right? Because you want to think, okay, we've got 3 flex containers here. The first one, so if I just kind of put a snippet on this, right? The first Flex container has 3 children, which are the blue articles. And they're in a row by default. So this is the first Flex parent. The second Flex parent is this article, which is in a column format, which is why the 3 divs that are in this article are going in a column format. And then the third is this individual div, which puts them back in a row, right? So you can do entire page layouts, as we've started to do here, using Flexbox. And you can get very, you can get whatever layout, generally speaking, that you should be looking for. And beautiful out of the box, we've got a responsive page that's pretty much doing what you would expect it to do. And so I think by just looking at that. Last concept here, cross-browser compatibility. Flexbox support is available in most new browsers, Firefox, Chrome, Opera Edge, IE 11. However, you should be aware that there are still older browsers that don't support Flexbox. While you're just learning and experimenting, this doesn't matter too much. However, if you're considering using Flexbox in a real website, you need to do testing and make sure that your user experience is still acceptable in as many browsers as possible. Flexbox is a bit trickier than some CSS features. For example, if a browser is missing a CSS drop shadow, then it will likely still be usable. Not supporting Flexbox features, however, will probably break the layout completely, making it unusable. So it just boils down to know your target audience. If your target audience is the government and they're using old technology, old computers, old browsers, then you're probably not able to use Flexbox. See also CSS Tricks, a guide to Flexbox, and Flexbox Froggy. I'm using all the good resources. Okay, that might have been a little bit painful to kind of see me slowly go through this, but I just think it's beneficial. Hopefully you learned a thing or two. Questions, comments, concerns on Discord? Okay. I'm going to open up the third lab. Today's lab. Tomorrow we'll have our hands-on test. So we're probably going to start tomorrow with lab and finish tomorrow with the hands-on test. Okay?